Breath of the Wild's world is an absolutely massive, awe-inspiring place. Its Hyrule spans thick tropical jungles and arid deserts, soars to breathtaking snowy heights and dives to the rocky floor of snaking canyons. It's a play space that radically changes when day turns to night, or when clear skies give way to raging thunderstorms. There is just so much to discover, and it's all completely open, a vast landscape waiting to be explored. Or at least it soon becomes completely open once players conclude what has to be one of the best tutorials in the history of gaming, the Great Plateau. This raised landmass represents a microcosm of Greater Hyrule, taking in ruins, forests, snowy mountains, open plains and more. It sets the tone for what is to come by giving players a little direction and a whole lot of freedom. Casting a seasoned eye over the Great Plateau, however, it's not hard to see the invisible hand of Nintendo's designers, doing all they can to ensure players make certain discoveries and connections, and thus set themselves up for success. From the way Sheikah powers are first introduced within shrines and are then immediately useful in the overworld, through to the lateral thinking encouraged by the wide variety of enemy encampments. What follows is a look at why the Great Plateau is a masterclass in game tutorials. This is Art of the Level. It's worth taking a moment before we get started to remember just how radical Breath of the Wild was and is within the Zelda franchise. This is a game that upends almost all the gameplay traditions of the series, replacing very curated abilities, objectives, and puzzles with systems and mechanics that lean into emergent, unpredictable gameplay. It's the job of the opening section of the game to make sure the player base understands just how different it is. And right from the moment Link wakes up in the Shrine of Resurrection, the game is laser focused on doing just that. This, right here, is the obvious money shot. In this one moment is the promise of a true open world Zelda experience, of exploration and discovery, of adventures and challenges to overcome. But as stunning as this title sequence is, it's not actually telling players anything about the gameplay. So what is? Basically everything else. Let's rewind to the moment Link comes to, semi-naked with no green garb anywhere in sight. Instead, he's given a mysterious technological device which opens the way forward where two treasure chests await. Link can now change his clothes, it seems. Players are also immediately introduced to Link's newfound ability to climb. It's a seemingly insignificant moment, that's one hell of a small ledge after all, but summoning it without a hookshot or other device is a low-key game changer. I mean, how many iconic video game protagonists would be stuck here forever? Coming back to the title sequence, players are left in no doubt as to where the game wants them to go. This path is dense, with small yet somehow profound things to discover. Like this stick. No, seriously. It's placed right in Link's path, and if the player picks it up, they'll learn how to swing it. This is a declarative moment from the designers. Link, at least initially, will fight with whatever he happens to come across. Small learning moments such as this come one after the other. It's impossible not to notice the mushrooms, for instance, and once again, a context-sensitive menu pops up as Link gets close, letting him choose to pick them. As players start to understand this new foraging life for Link, they may spot a lizard in the grass or a beetle on a tree, and those too can be plucked and stored away. And then at the top of the path sits a boulder. Some players will likely go over to it and realise it can be pushed. Nothing much happens as it tumbles down the slope, but it represents yet another shift in perspective. Not only is this a foraging, found object using clothes equipping Link, but his world is a physics playground. So far we've talked about very deliberately placed items and obstacles in Link's path, but the other thing that the Great Plateau section of Breath of the Wild does very well is to adapt based on player behaviour. What if a player didn't open the conveniently placed treasure chests or decided not to put on the clothes? Well, when they reach the old man, he'll allude to that fact. And you get a spicier title cutscene. Perhaps the player exited the Shrine of Resurrection and opted to climb the cliff face. No problem. The old man and his campfire can be ignored altogether, and he'll catch up with Link later. Oh! The game is completely fine with players opting out of everything it wants to subtly introduce them to, and will instead simply ensure that players still receive their first main objective, a location on the map. They can get to that point any way they like, but let's hop back to the game's expected path and Link's first encounter with the old man. Once again, the game tempts players with an item they can interact with. In this case, it turns out to be a roasted apple, and the old man jokes about Link stealing it. More importantly, he drops a big hint. Actually, it's more like an invitation given there's an apple tree right next to the campfire. Maybe players pick an apple and try and cook it then and there, maybe they don't. Maybe they chat to the old man again. Either way, the seed has been planted that fire is a tool in Breath of the Wild. Continuing on, players come across a woodcutter's axe. This is clearly an upgrade from a tree branch, but also another non-traditional weapon. Perhaps it really is for chopping down trees. Link has to fight with something, however, and if he's still holding the tree branch, players quickly discover just how literal Breath of the Wild's break from tradition is. At this point, the player is only a few minutes into their adventure, but is already starting to understand the systems that underpin everything in Breath of the Wild. The importance of foraging, of clothing, of physics, of fire, the fact that weapons can break. These are the building blocks. Of course, there are many more to come, but since the next core lessons are all at specific locations, first Zelda's waypoint, then the 4 shrines, the journey can start to open up more. Even the path to the waypoint is full of distractions to tempt players. These are opportunities to learn more about this world and how much agency Link has within it. And to help the player realise that Breath of the Wild's Hyrule is one big playground. The next step, raising up the Great Plateau Tower, is a big shift, giving players an interactive map of the area, not to mention spinning up 2 more foundational design elements, time and weather. Up until this point, no matter how long players stood lost in thought upon a cliff top, day would never turn to night, nor would the weather ever change. Those elements weren't even represented on the HUD, and when they do kick into gear, they're not actually formally introduced. Players may not even notice the new information. Instead, night will simply fall. The dead will simply rise from the ground. The revelation that night is a whole other world is something for players to discover for themselves. To battle Keese and style Koblins, and come across enemy camps in which almost everyone is passed out on the ground asleep. Weather is handled slightly differently. While the forecast is revealed on the HUD at the same time as the clock, it will never actually rain until Link has acquired the paraglider. At that point, and only that point, will rain and thunderstorms become possible on the Great Plateau. This was a smart design decision. One of the biggest pain points for less experienced players in Breath of the Wild is the fact that rain makes climbing much harder, if not impossible. It would feel absolutely punishing for rain to blow in while trying to climb to, say, the Stasis Trial. So Nintendo ensures that potential friction simply can't happen. And indeed, what the designers are doing with these staggered introductions in general is trying to steer clear of difficulty spikes and doing what they can to avoid overwhelming players. There's so much to take in that it still feels dizzying, but small measures like these create a logical evolution of the world that players aren't necessarily conscious of, but that do make a big difference. There's also no real need to explain systems like time and weather. They're core elements of the simulated world, and uncovering their secrets and uses naturally is part of the fun. The Sheikah powers, on the other hand, are very direct gameplay tools. So not only does Breath of the Wild give each a spotlight in the form of a shrine, but it then, not so subtly, gives each new power an immediate application in the overworld. After unlocking Magnesis, for instance, players soon realise they're in an area brimming with metal objects. There are treasure chests waiting to be dredged up or just out of reach, not to mention physics to be played with. Get the remote bombs and Link's first target is literally in front of him. It's the same for all 4. Immediately putting the lessons learnt inside the shrines into real-world practice is an important step in giving players a tangible sense of how they're integrated into the broader gameplay. There's very much an intended order for tackling the first couple of shrines, and it's no accident that the easiest shrines to reach also unlock the most intuitively useful powers. Even so, players are free to forge their own path, and the game does an excellent job of allowing this to happen. In a broad sense, this is because every challenge on the Great Plateau is custom built for a Link with 3 stars, baseline stamina, and very basic gear. That pillar? Turns out Vanilla Link has just enough stamina to make it to the top, and look how pumped he is. The climb up to the stasis trial? Same deal. The Great Plateau is a playground within which players can experiment, but with the benefit of a safety net. A figurative one, that is. More specifically, however, there's always a way for enterprising individuals to get to their destination. Let's say a player wanted to do the Cryonis trial first. Well, one way would be to head up past the Temple of Time to the banks of the icy River of the Dead. The drop in temperature alone presents a significant obstacle, but there are numerous tools close to hand that can help Link to survive the cold. And once that's no longer an issue, the area contains several subtle hints as to how Link may be able to cross the treacherous water without any Sheikah powers. Putting together the pieces of this puzzle isn't necessarily hard, but it certainly rewards observant players. This is true of the many combat set pieces too. Each enemy camp is designed to present new learning opportunities for players, and with every realisation, the possibilities grow. It's not long, for instance, before Link is sniping guards before they sound the alarm, and stealing gear out from under Boko snouts to get the drop on them. And that's far from the only kind of drop. Similarly, day can be turned to night for a tactical edge, and the environment itself can be turned into a weapon. These many encounters underline that planning is important, but also that combat is chaotic. Link can disarm an enemy and take its weapon, but it will still find ways to attack. Often ill-advised ways, but still. And Link too must adapt, dealing with weapons and shields that break and plans that backfire. Forcing players to change gears on the fly, and perhaps discover how to use a weapon they'd previously ignored, is a crucial part of preparing them for the time when they'll leave the Great Plateau. So too are the hints at what is to come. While red bokoblins are very much the main foe of the Great Plateau, and a winning foe they are too, Nintendo also made sure to underline that players should never be too complacent in this world. A pile of rocks in a peaceful glade suddenly heaving itself to its feet and proceeding to pummel the player is a truly standout moment. As is the first time a seemingly broken down, decrepit old guardian comes back to life. These confrontations tell players that they aren't necessarily able to take on everything as they come across it, at least not without a considered, effective strategy. Given players can traverse the Great Plateau in any order, Nintendo's designers have gone to great lengths to ensure that this area is as flexible as possible. For instance, while players can cook a meal or elixir to protect Link from the cold, that's not the only option. There's also a diary in the old man's cottage that hints at a recipe. The reward? A warm doublet. That's not the only way to get this coat either. If Link makes it to the top of Mount Hylia, the old man will simply give it to him. Another neat touch is that if players read the old man's diary after he has revealed his true identity, it's written as a letter to Link from King Roam himself. The Great Plateau cleverly delivers the same lessons in slightly different ways. If one player doesn't need to cook to ward off the cold, for instance, maybe they'll try making a meal from the many stamina shrooms near the climb up to the stasis trial. And if a player doesn't get across the River of the Dead by making their own bridge, maybe they'll learn how to fell a tree to do the same. Foundational lessons also have knock-on effects. Once players realise the power of cooking, foraging and hunting suddenly make so much more sense. This then leads to other discoveries, such as using stasis to find ingredients, and the fact that seemingly the entire world is one giant game of hide and seek. And even when players are given explicit instructions, they're more of a nudge in the right direction than anything else. The old man may be very keen to tell players that they can toss ingredients into a cooking pot, but that still leaves them with an inventory full of potentially powerful recipes to discover. Or not. And even when the game does want to instruct players, it's up to them to actually be paying attention. Very little is spoon-fed. Unsurprisingly then, trial and error is at the heart of the player's time on the Great Plateau, but crucially, much of it is driven by common sense logic. Of course an axe can chop wooden crates and fortifications as well as it chops trees. Of course a korok leaf can blow bokos as well as it does a sail. And of course if Link can be frozen, so too can enemies. And then you can start combining things. The way interactions work in Breath of the Wild generally just feel intuitively right. And on top of the systems themselves, this has a lot to do with the many small details lavished on the presentation. If Link's freezing cold, it's obvious that he's freezing cold. If he's trudging through snow, players can see and hear that he's moving slower. And if he's used up all his stamina, well, that's hard to miss. All these connections and contextual elements come together in surprising and often delightful ways. Where previous Zelda games were about prescribed problem solving, Breath of the Wild is defined by its emergent moments.
You have been asleep for the past 100 years.
The Great Plateau doesn't just set up the core gameplay mechanics, it also lays the groundwork for Breath of the Wild's story. During this opening section, players learn that Link has been asleep for 100 years. They see Hyrule Castle engulfed in malice, and they hear Zelda entreat our hero to hurry.
Before it's too late.
They spend time with the mysterious old man who clearly knows more than he's letting on, and they start to understand what the Sheikah slate represents. A key that can potentially unlock knowledge and power that has been hidden away since primeval times. And once the 4 shrines are completed, the game's opening section reaches its climax. Players are finally introduced to King Rhoam, and are told of the events leading up to Link's long slumber in the Shrine of Resurrection. The goals for the rest of the game are laid out. The ultimate task of defeating Calamity Ganon and rescuing Zelda from Hyrule Castle, as well as the fact that each of the divine beasts, not to mention the many guardians, are still controlled by this evil presence. This is the beginning of Link's journey through wider Hyrule. It's the moment when the full enormity of the quest is revealed, and when players get their hands on the device that truly makes Breath of the Wild soar, the paraglider. It's hard to overstate how liberating the paraglider is to use after all that journeying on foot, and it's a fittingly powerful reward for an impressively strong opening few hours. And once Link begins his adventure beyond the Great Plateau, the raised, sprawling landmass that once felt so big begins to feel positively small. And it is small compared to the full map. The marvellous thing about the Great Plateau is that it's the player's whole world until that point. And it's rich, and it's varied, and it's mysterious. It's an absorbing slice of the game, and lays the foundation to understand the whole. Yet, when you leap off its walls, the true, staggering size of Hyrule starts to sink in. Yet another reveal in a long string of game-changing reveals. The Great Plateau is Hyrule in miniature, a brilliant distillation of a wild and untamed land. It's a wonderful piece of design, the ideal way to introduce a playground of this magnitude, allowing the player to take their first, confident steps in a journey that need never end. For more on Breath of the Wild, be sure to check out 150 tiny things that make Breath of the Wild a game for the ages. And for everything else, you're in the right place. IGN.